Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to the Study Focused Learners. Have you ever really stopped to consider how terrifyingly fragile human history actually is? Today, we are embarking on a true linguistic detective journey through ancient eschatology, and we're going to discover how a single drop of ink, literally a tiny vowel point added centuries after the original fact, can completely and totally shift how millions of people view the end of the world. Now, all of the incredible insights we're exploring today are sourced directly from a really detailed presentation by Ken Johnson over at Bible Facts. You can actually find a link to his original source material right down in the description below the video. Highly recommend checking it out. We have some fascinating, paradigm-shifting ground to cover today, so let's get right to it. So here is our structured pathway for this study. We'll start by setting the historical stage with the future abomination, and then we'll look at the prophetic timeline gap. After that, things get really interesting as we dig into the language mechanics in translating the ascent and the transgressors of Daniel. Finally, we'll see how the source pieces this all together in removing the restrainer before we wrap up with a rapid-fire round of ancient text and answers. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the future abomination. To really understand the linguistic mystery we are about to unpack, we first have to understand the specific prophetic setup that the source presents to us. It all hinges on a very famous statement made by Jesus in the book of Matthew. He points directly back to the Old Testament prophet Daniel, saying, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Now, according to the source, Jesus spoke these words sometime around 30 to 32 AD, and he was warning his followers about an event that was yet to come. This is crucial because, for centuries prior, a lot of scholars just assumed Daniel's prophecy was already fulfilled. They pointed to a historical figure named Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus was this ruthless Greek king who notoriously desecrated the Jewish temple by slaughtering a pig on the sacred altar. And honestly, it certainly sounded like an abomination. But the source points out a massive, undeniable mathematical problem with that theory. Think about the math for a second. Antiochus Epiphanes is dying roughly 160 years before Jesus was even born. Because Jesus is actively speaking about this event as something that is yet to happen in the future, it completely rules out Antiochus as the final fulfillment. And that specific timeline math creates the entire foundation for the study's premise. If the ultimate abomination of desolation didn't happen in the past under Antiochus, well, it absolutely must point to a future figure, an antichrist desecrating a newly rebuilt temple at the end of days. Just think about the massive geopolitical shifts required for a third temple to be rebuilt in modern Jerusalem today. It implies monumental future events and raises the stakes of this entire timeline. This establishes that the prophecies in Daniel are not just ancient historical footnotes. According to the source, they are active, unfulfilled blueprints. But to really see how that timeline works, we have to look closely at the historical gaps. Which brings us to Section 2, the prophetic timeline gap. The source dives deep into Daniel chapter 9, specifically verse 27. This contains the really famous 70 weeks prophecy. To grasp this, we need to slow down and look at how these so-called weeks actually operate. In the original Hebrew text, the word used is Shabuah, which literally translates to a 7. So we are not talking about weeks of days here. They are weeks of years, basically 7-year periods. The prophecy outlines 70 of these 7-year periods in total. The source explains that the first 69 weeks run continuously, right up until the time the Messiah is cut off, or crucified, around 32 AD. But then, the prophetic clock essentially hits a giant pause button. In 70 AD, a Roman prince destroys the sanctuary and Israel is dispersed. This creates a massive historical gap, often referred to as the Church Age, that has lasted for nearly 2,000 years now. That final 1 week, that very last 7-year tribulation period, it is still waiting to tick down. And right at that historical pause button in 70 AD, there is just an incredible story. The crucial point here revolves around the biblical word for a leader, prince. The man who historically destroyed the temple in 70 AD was Titus. But here's the thing. Titus was a Roman general. He wasn't a prince. If you had shown him Daniel's prophecy on the very day he burned down the temple, he would have totally dismissed it as inaccurate. However, the source notes this breathtaking twist of history. During the brutal, drawn-out siege of Jerusalem, the Roman Caesar died back home. Scrambling to prevent a hostile takeover and a massive civil war, the Roman Senate quietly elected Vespasian, who happened to be Titus's father, as the new emperor. They sent emergency orders for Vespasian to return to Rome immediately, leaving Titus solely in charge of the siege. Without even going it, the very second his father was elevated as Caesar, General Titus officially became a prince. He perfectly fulfilled the exact wording of the ancient prophecy on the very day the temple fell. Incredible, right? Let's move into Section 3, Translating the Ascent. So we are now shifting from historical timelines into the core linguistic mystery of this entire study. The source takes us to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, a text that details the preconditions for that final 7-year tribulation we mentioned. The text says that this day of darkness will not come until a specific event happens first. In Greek, the word used for this event is apostasia. Now, we usually translate this as apostasy or a spiritual rebellion against the faith, but the root verb actually just means a departure, like literally physically walking out a door. So what if Paul wasn't just talking about people losing their religion, but something far more literal? When you look at the Hebrew translation of this text, the word used is Maal. What is absolutely mind-blowing about Maal is its literal dual meaning. On one hand, it means moving upward, an ascent or physical rising, much like a rapture. But on the other hand, it also means to go above and beyond a set of laws, meaning a trespass or a rebellion. The source argues this dual meaning wasn't an accident. It was entirely on purpose, implying both a physical departure and a spiritual rebellion happening simultaneously. This perfectly sets up Section 4, the transgressors of Daniel. The source takes this dual-meaning concept from the New Testament and searches for a parallel back in the Old Testament, finding a stunning linguistic bridge in Daniel chapter 8. Now, to really grasp the gravity of this, you have to understand how ancient Hebrew was originally written. Originally, it contained no vowels whatsoever. None. It was just consonants. Imagine trying to read a book like that today. The vowel markers, those little dots and dashes you might see in modern Hebrew, were added much, much later, around 800 AD, by a group of Jewish scholars called the Masoretes. They were just trying to standardize pronunciation centuries after the texts were penned. The source points out that in Daniel 8:23, the root word used is pasha. With the specific vowels the Masoretes chose to add in 800 AD, it translates to transgressors or rebels. But if you read that exact same ancient ink without those added vowels, or even just with different vocalization, it means to march, to step, or to go up. It is staggering to think about. We have a single ancient text that can simultaneously mean a dark rebellion forming or a group of people physically ascending, entirely depending on a dot of ink added a millennium later. And that exact revelation leads the source to offer a custom, integrated translation of Daniel 8:23. Listen closely to how this totally rewires the text. In the aftermath of their kingdom, as the rebels, or those ascending, finish, a king of fierce countenance shall stand up. By substituting those ascending for rebels, it fundamentally changes the identity of the people in the verse. The translation perfectly links the finishing of the ascent, which the source associates with the rapture of believers, to the immediate rise of the fierce king, the antichrist. Let's look at the logical flow of this in Section 5, removing the restrainer. By combining these linguistic clues, the source pieces together a highly specific step-by-step logical argument for a pre-tribulation timeline. Here is the progression. Step 1. The true believers currently act as a restrainer against total global lawlessness, basically holding back the tide. This restrainer must be removed via the ascent or departure we just translated. Step 2. Once the restrainer is physically gone, it's like a chain reaction. The apostasy, the global rebellion or trespass, is no longer held back. Global lawlessness can now fully realize and form without any moral friction at all. Step 3. Only after the ascent is finished and the societal apostasy is fully formed can the lawless one be revealed. Why is the Antichrist called the lawless one? Because he rises in a vacuum completely devoid of the restrainer. According to the source, this linguistic study proves the departure absolutely must precede the revealing of the Antichrist. Finally, let's round this out with Section 6, Ancient Texts and Answers. Moving beyond the core linguistic thesis, the source's Q&A session explored a really dense web of broader theological context. Let's expand on these key points just to see how it all fits together. First is the Ezekiel 38 War, often called the Gog and Magog War. The source neutrally presents current Middle Eastern geopolitics, particularly involving nations like Iran and Russia, as the active staging ground for this massive future conflict, though he is careful to note a specific timeline gap must still occur before it actually triggers. Second, he discusses the Dead Sea Scrolls. When these ancient jars were uncovered, they contained fragments of extra-biblical texts like the Book of Enoch and Jubilees. The source argues that finding them right alongside canonical scripture lends immense historical weight to them, validating that first-century believers treated these specific texts as deeply important context for the spiritual realm. Third, he outlines the Noahide laws. These are basic moral codes supposedly given to humanity after Noah's flood. The source suggests a chilling theory here. A future global leader could theoretically weaponize these ancient, universally appealing laws to persecute anyone who holds to distinct, exclusive theological views, like the Christian Trinity, framing them as a literal threat to global unity. Finally, he unpacks the ancient debate between angels and Christophanies. When a divine figure appeared in the Old Testament, was it merely an angelic messenger, or was it a pre-incarnate physical appearance of Christ himself? It's a fascinating look at how ancient scholars categorize the divine. So let me ask you, why does all of this matter? Well, for followers of this source, this isn't just a dry academic exercise. It brilliantly illustrates that a single drop of ink, a tiny vowel point added centuries after the original author died, can fundamentally alter the timeline of a globally recognized belief system. Whether you view that ancient word pasha as a dark rebellion or a glorious ascent, entirely shifts how you view the sequence of the end of the world. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to consider today. How heavily should modern eschatology rely on the fragile translation of ancient vowelless languages? It is a stark, lingering reminder of the immense power and the inherent fragility of translated texts. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep linguistic study. We hope it's sparked your curiosity, and we'll see you on the next one.